Many of you know of me. This is who you see me as these days in the 21st century. So this is how I shall present myself to you. But what do you really know of me, AnneBoleyn, or AnneBoleyn as you know me through history? What do you know of me, the person, the human, the woman, and what life was like? To reach for the stars, to the greatest of heights, but also to possess intelligence, independence, or a need for that at a time when women quietly yet determinedly thought and read, if they were able to read, about their thoughts and their faith and their loves and their children. One can read so much about what one should have done. Myself, what should I have done at that time? But you are looking at me through the benefit of centuries and of the morals of your own time. And they are so different. And yet at the same time, we as human beings, as women, as men, still have the same needs, thoughts, as we always did. We have not changed in that way. Believe me. And I watch and I see the portrayals of me, an amalgam of so much and so many playing my role, if you like. But that is not the whole story, is it? It is not a TV serial, a book, a discussion by historians. This is about me and what I left behind in my life, or wanted to leave behind in my life. And I know so many of you will have read about me, read the facts, the dates, and interpreted things differently, and why not? That's allowed, isn't it? We do that with everyone. But you must remember, I was a real person. The people around me were real people, and we were dealing in very difficult times. Even the man that I eventually married, the King, Henry VIII of England. Difficult times, frightening times, unpredictable times, and we had to learn how to navigate those times. So if you are interested at all, I will just talk to you for a short while about me, my life, and the legacy I left behind. For some, I imagine, you would like the facts, and that's fine. So here they are. I, AnneBoleyn, was born around 1501, some say 1507, but you have to understand that in those days, people didn't necessarily write down dates immediately. I was the daughter of courtier and diplomat Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard, and I spent time at the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France before joining the English court in around the late 1521 to serve the Queen and wife to Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, as her lady-in-waiting. Catherine of Aragon, as I'm sure many of you know, had been betrothed from birth to Arthur, Prince of Wales, son of Henry VII and Elizabeth, daughter of Henry IV, the Sun King. Catherine travelled to England from Spain with her ladies to meet her future husband Arthur, and they were indeed married with great ceremony and travelled to Ludlow, the castle chosen for the Prince of Wales, Arthur's home, as a newly married couple to live, to get to know each other, and hopefully to produce heirs. Unfortunately, Arthur and indeed Catherine developed, like so many in the castle at that time in Ludlow, what we used to call the sweating sickness, and Arthur died. There was huge grief, obviously, with his parents and his brother Henry. I heard that Catherine was devastated. She's a young girl in her teens, left adrift, left with no understanding of what might happen to her. It was left for a while because they hoped that she and Arthur had conceived a child by their little honeymoon, their short honeymoon, if you like, together. And once she was recovered, and recovered she did, she was returned to the King and Queen of England, Elizabeth and Henry VII, to await what may befall her. But as we know, after quite a few years, and actually being quite neglected, she was betrothed to Henry VIII. He apparently had fallen in love with her when he first saw her, being wed to his brother Arthur. She was auburn hair and very beautiful as a young girl. And they had a lot in common, and married once Henry VII died, and stayed quite a team, shall we say, in 2023 parlance as a couple for many years. Little is known by many that she held and fought for England against Scotland whilst Henry was in France. She was the daughter of two warrior monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Philippe. And she held England safe until Henry returned. The sadness for them both was that many children were either conceived and died in the womb or were stillborn, and only one survived, Mary. But they loved her very dearly, but always at the back of the mind was she was not a boy, she was not a son, and this was paramount to Henry. So I've given you a history, if you like, a brief history, of which I'm sure so many of you are aware, which leads me to my own story. I think it's relevant to that little past history. And once I was back at court as Catherine of Aragon's lady-in-waiting around 1521. I had learnt a lot from the French court. Queen Claude of France was an amazingly intelligent, forward-thinking queen, probably way before her time, and had taught me so many things, opened my mind to so many readings of new thoughts on religion and life in general. How to prove that you were intelligent without being forceful, because you could not be so. Or if you were, you had to do it with care when you were with the men. So I returned, almost a different woman, some say, but deep down I think I was always that person. But that's just my opinion. And then Henry VIII and I crossed paths, if you like, more than we would have done before. Whatever you know of me and our story, you must know that once we established this amazing connection, it wasn't just lust, it was because we met with our minds, our intelligence, and we connected. And still, in the British Museum in London and many other places, you can find things like my Book of Hours, which is akin to a prayer book, if you like, with illustrations, where I would write things about him, he sent me letters of love, which you can still find to read to this day. My own letters have disappeared, and I think once I was condemned, they were held perhaps in Italy by the Pope, because I wanted to reform, not with any kind of force, as is what happened. I wanted to reform how people, the normal people, whatever that is, from whatever level of life they lived, that they were allowed to talk to God, speak to God, learn about God, and not necessarily be in church to do so. They didn't always have that opportunity. Little is known too that I would spend a lot of time donating and helping the poor, the needy, wherever I could, before I married Henry. So, when I'm connected, if you like, as I've said, with Henry, it was probably around 1526 that we really felt we wanted to be, well, I didn't want to be his mistress. I didn't. I had seen what had happened to my sister Mary Boleyn. Yes, she was married to William Carey. Yes, of course. And bore 2 children, and still to this day there is talk about whether one was Henry's. Both were Henry's. Henry VIII I'm talking about here. But she, at the end of the day, was discarded, if you like, by Henry. He'd lost interest and moved on to me, and I was determined not to be a mistress. And perhaps, looking back, and these are just my thoughts, my drive, my love, my need was to be his match, his partner. And somewhere along the line, Catherine, his wife, became, in my mind, potentially irrelevant. That's a harsh word, I know, but maybe it's so when I look back. I'm not a bad person, but I do know what I want. I knew what I wanted then, and I wanted Henry, and I wanted to be by his side, and I wanted to give him children that were legitimate and would then be heirs to the throne. I wanted a man who I could talk to and discuss things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I believed he was that man, that he was open to listening. You must remember, and I must say this out loud, that the caricature, as I call it, that I see as I wander around and see today of my Henry, this big, fat, paranoid creature that has become like Bluebeard in our history, that wasn't the man that I knew then, first, and loved. That came later, tragically for him, tragically obviously for me, but for anyone else in his path. But he was not always like that. That I want to say. and stress. In August 1527, Henry decided to ask the Pope for a dispensation to allow me to marry with him. It was called the King's Great Matter, which equates to the meaning Henry's struggle for an annulment of his marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon. And we had to wait 7 years to marry, which I know many of you know already. And we did marry, and I was crowned Queen on the 1st of June 1533. I was pregnant at the time, albeit we hid it, and I gave birth to a daughter who we called Elizabeth. Henry, my husband the king, loved his daughter, but she was not a boy or his son. Throughout our short marriage of 3 years, only 3 years after all this time of trying to be together legitimately, we went through sadness of lost, unsuccessful pregnancies. I have to say, and this is just my thoughts obviously, once I became the queen, a crowned queen, and one has to recognise the importance of that at that time. And even now, to be fair, looking at the current monarchy, it is an important role in itself. Once I became queen, I lost some humility perhaps in how I dealt with those around me. Thomas Cromwell, who worked for Henry, who had been my friend for years, who believed in trying to help the poor, take all the masses of money away from the Catholic Church and the Reformation, of which here in England we know well, became disenchanted. We argued. So much history, so much sadness, to the extent that I became outspoken, thoughtless, perhaps, and I wasn't producing a son like Henry had hoped. I had hoped. And so charges were laid against me that I was unfaithful in so many hideous ways. I stood up and I spoke my piece. I tried to save the people around me who were accused, including my own brother, God bless him, to no avail. I had just lost a child earlier in 1536. Whilst this was all brewing, if you like, under the surface, I knew something was wrong, but not to the extent of it. But I was arrested. And Henry would not listen to me. He had met Jane Seymour, one of my ladies in waiting, and that was that, really. She was very, very different character from me. I think perhaps that's why. I don't know. I don't have any to ask now, do I? But she was very different. She appeared quiet, studious, almost bland. But underneath there was a core of steel, which history doesn't really write about. But nevertheless, he wanted her. So he hired a French swordsman to come across, and I was executed on the 19th of May, 1536. They said I plotted for his death, but I would never have done that. Not to Henry, the man I loved. For I did love him. On the scaffold I gave a speech, a very famous speech, about not blaming him, to put it into daytime terms, simplistic terms. And you know why I did that? This is just my opinion. I needed to keep my daughter, our daughter, Elizabeth, safe. If I had said anything negative against the king, harm may have befallen my Elizabeth, my beautiful, red-haired Tudor Elizabeth. And that I would not do. When I confessed before I was executed, and you have to bear in mind, I was a very religious woman. So when one confesses before death, it's important not to lie before God. And I swore to God I had never committed any adultery or treason against my husband, the King, Henry. Never. And especially never for the sake of my dearest daughter, born into marriage legitimately. And as I look back now, still, and I see what my daughter, our daughter, Elizabeth I achieved, what a monarch. What a monarch she was, and still is remembered to be. She wasn't perfect, but she was an amazing blend of Henry and myself. These are just my thoughts. You may disagree, and you're allowed, but these are my thoughts. Take care, God bless, AnneBoleyn.